Hello. Today we will be discussing Chapter 5 of Richard C. Box's Essential History for Public Administration. Chapter 5 is Confronting Injustice and Inequity, the Great Society. Members in our group are Jack Anderson, Timothy Postlethwaite, Mia Shigemura, and myself, Charlie Blackmer. The Great Society period comprises a relatively short time frame. Influenced by societal and economic conditions during and after World War II, the core of this period is generally considered to be the 1960s and early 1970s, and more specifically, during the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson from 1963 to 1969. In our handout, you will see a more detailed timeline of the period, as featured in this slide. During our presentation, Jack will establish the social and economic conditions of the Great Society era, addressed by legislative action, which will be outlined by Tim. Finally, Mia will look at this era through the lens of public administration. Thank you, and now over to Jack.
This portion of our presentation will cover the overarching social, political, and economic conditions of the era in which governmental intervention was increasingly present, marking one of the most recent periods of major changes in the role of the federal government in U.S. history. In providing the background and context for this era, we will discuss the various conditions present, which largely consisted of a post-war economy following World War II, global dominance and geopolitical concerns, the rise of suburbia and changing social conditions, environmental deterioration in response, and a cross-cutting struggle for civil rights, namely among Black Americans. The federal government during this era shifted from a position of more limited governmental intervention to a system with significant and far-reaching reforms during a period of relative calm and stability throughout the country. As Box discusses, the Great Society era continued to realize relatively strong economic conditions, largely fostered by the scale of wartime production of various goods, equipment, and materials to support the U.S. military in World War II. This era established widespread production of materials and goods as the nation built a strong governmental-private sector relationship in organizing adaptable, high-output manufacturing and assembly in nearly all sectors of the U.S. economy. While there were concerns about a potential post-war economic downturn, the U.S. did not in fact realize this downturn, as millions of Americans returned home from overseas ready to work. With these conditions, the middle class grew significantly during this period. As Box points out, the U.S. at the early part of this era possessed nearly half of the world's income and accounted for half of the world's manufacturing output. While the U.S. was experiencing a significant economic boom during this time, it is important to note, however, that this experience was not felt equally. Women were confined to low-level or clerical roles, often in retail, education, or healthcare, and many other women were also expected to stay at home to raise families during this time. And notably, African Americans faced racial discrimination, which led to poverty, unemployment, and poor housing, an area which we'll cover in more depth shortly. Moving to geopolitical competition, this period was marked by a general perception of fear of the outsider, that being the communist, whether that was an individual from a communist country or an American who sympathized with communist or socialist causes and ideals. The Cold War dominated this era in which the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a nuclear arms race to establish global dominance. And as this competition heated up during this era, the US was consumed by a Red Scare, or a fear of communism that took a hold of national politics. There was a widespread fear that communist ideals or people with un-American views were present in positions of power and influence in both government and business. And notably, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin conducted a series of congressional hearings on communist influence, as well as homosexuals in government, urging individuals to publicly identify others who may be communists. It is important to note during this time that McCarthy's legacy was not a positive one. McCarthy was seen as a crude and boorish individual who attacked important government officials and the military, and who was seen as an opportunist. By the end of his time, McCarthy was largely discredited and ignored by congressional colleagues and the general public. But importantly, the term McCarthyism originated from this era, meaning unsupported accusations and attacks on an individual's character, reputation, or patriotism. And this term served as a reminder that politically driven scapegoating and personal attacks that feed on the public sphere of outsiders can threaten individual rights and freedom of expression. And considering some of the social conditions of this era, during the Great Society, millions of couples and families moved to suburbs to fulfill the dream of owning their own small plot of land in a safe and quiet environment. This unprecedented housing boom was largely fueled by the poor conditions and limited amenities of existing homes, largely in city settings. Notably, 35 million Americans were living in the suburbs in 1950. By the 1970s, however, this number had grown to 72 million of the total population of the United States at the time of 205 million. It's important to note that those moving from cities to suburbs were almost exclusively white people with significant financial resources, giving rise to the term white flight, as African Americans and low-income individuals were left behind in the city, resulting in deteriorating urban services, poor living conditions, and the rise of massive public housing complexes. This population shift brought with it notable changes to the economy and cultural values relative to religion, family, popular culture, and national identity. Suburbia really did become a way of life, typically in which a married couple with children lived in a detached single-family home away from other places and community amenities. Distinctive gender roles also became present during this time, with the male being the breadwinner, commuting alone in his own vehicle to work in the city, and his wife typically staying at home during this time to take care of children and household tasks. Also of note, couples maintained an active social life with other couples and families who lived in the suburbs. Occupational shifts during this time took the shape of moving from agricultural, factory, and manufacturing jobs to large-scale commercial enterprises in organizational office settings. Global commerce and giant corporations required hierarchical structures of managers and technical professionals. This shift in economics and occupational settings fueled an ongoing debate and criticism of individuality versus conformity. With cookie-cutter suburbs and large workplace organizations that expect conformity, a loss of individuality and a tyranny of the majority reigned during this era. Moving to the environment, given the era's massive industrial production and economic boom, significant economic deterioration resulted. Notably, the automobile industry contributed significantly to poor air quality, both through its manufacturing processes, as well as the increase in widespread use of personal vehicles, with many Americans commuting between suburbs and cities for work and other purposes, as we just previously discussed. Household waste was also a significant issue, as many multifamily housing units in city settings utilized trash incinerators, also contributing to poor air quality, and industries would pollute and dump waste into rivers, resulting in periodic fires of rivers, such as the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, and widespread acid rain destroying aquatic and plant life in areas throughout the United States. In documenting these concerns, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service publication editor-in-chief Rachel Carson released a number of reports and books drawing attention to the scale and severity of this environmental degradation. Carson eventually left the Fish and Wildlife Service to write her own and final book, Silent Spring, which criticized the widespread and heavy use of pesticides in agricultural production. Carson's work provoked a firestorm of controversy, but significantly contributed to congressional action to ban the use of DDT and restrict other similar chemicals. And importantly, many of our current environmental protections originated from the Great Society era. Congress created the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, increased activities in protecting bodies of water, and restricted industrial, agricultural, and residential sources of waste. Moving to civil rights, this is perhaps one of the most important conditions to note during this era, since it was an ongoing and persistent struggle. The issue was a cross-cutting matter touching on virtually all aspects of American life, even if it was not explicit. People of color during this era experienced significant acts of discrimination and hardship in areas of housing, employment, education, the environment, and legal dimensions. This discrimination was particularly prevalent in the Southeast, but was present nationwide. These systemic acts of racism and discrimination plagued people of color and seriously disadvantaged these groups, with its impact still felt to this day. Racial unrest surfaced many times throughout this era as Black people protested against police violence, white people responded violently to rumors of Black men assaulting white women, and labor tensions between Black and whites often overflowed into civil unrest and violence. And importantly, lynchings occurred quite regularly during this era, as well as other acts of white violence against Blacks in major US cities. Notably, Blacks during this era came to challenge the longstanding Jim Crow state laws that required separation of races in public places, including restrooms, water fountains, hospitals, schools, cemeteries, and other facilities. The court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka in the 1950s ended the legal justification of separate but equal in educational settings, but a long period of resistance to school desegregation occurred. Jim Crow laws became a flashpoint of protest and resistance among people of color, with various civil rights figures, including Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., leading the charge. The collective efforts of these civil rights leaders resulted in boycotts of public bus systems, sit-ins of restaurants and other business establishments, and demonstrations, eventually turning the tide through a series of legal challenges and changing norms as restaurants and other facilities throughout the South were slowly desegregated. Another notable flashpoint during this period was the decision of the Birmingham, Alabama elected police chief, who was a racist, to turn police forces loose on a march of young people from a local church. Through popular media, people throughout the US and the world saw women and children violently attacked by police with batons, fire hoses, and dogs, ultimately leading to growing public pressure for national action to be taken. These events in Birmingham eventually led to a drafting of a congressional civil rights bill and the March on Washington, at which Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech for racial equality. In reflecting on these social, political, and economic conditions of this era, there were a handful of connections to the course that could be made, but I wanted to focus on just a handful, namely through the Guy and Ely text as well as the DeForest documentary. Given such a wide array of these forces at play, there were certainly an endless amount of wicked problems that arose, as Guy and Ely discussed in Chapter 1. These issues, whether civil rights or environmental protection, were unable to be addressed by the private sector and required governmental action. And importantly, a lot of these issues were unintended consequences of previous eras, particularly those related to civil rights and the economic progress that deteriorated the environment, for instance. This very concept of governmental intervention was further detailed in Chapter 8 of the Guy and Ely text, relative to conditions in which government should step in to ensure social goals, economic security, and legal protections. And last, the context of public service delivery and advancing the public interest, as discussed in Chapter 15, resonated very closely with the concepts and events detailed in the Box text. The conditions of this era, notably an unprecedented economic boom, widespread environmental degradation, struggle for civil rights, and shifting social and lifestyle factors, unquestionably generated policy inputs that reveal the need for various governmental action to better protect individuals, resources, and the country overall. And further, in reading through this chapter, I could not help but to think repeatedly about the DeForest documentary and many of the connections between the text and the video. Notably, the concept of race relations, civil rights, and disparate experiences of Americans was prevalent in both. Whether it was white flight, economic competition, the rise of suburbia, or the deteriorating inner city, this era was marked by periods of both significant growth for some and significant strife for others. The struggle for civil rights was certainly present as detailed by the police treatment of Black residents of Detroit and DeForest, and the struggles experienced by Black residents in Birmingham, Alabama in the Box text. And perhaps most importantly, a common and evident theme of this era is the disparate experiences of white Americans and Americans of color. As discussed, differences in virtually all aspects of daily life, whether employment, education, housing, legal matters, or economics, white Americans with financial resources had the privilege of a much different and more positive experience throughout this era. Next up, Tim will detail the key legislative and governmental features of the era, with Mia rounding out our presentation with a discussion of the implications on public administration and additional connections to course material.
My name is Timothy Postlewaite, and I will be breaking down for you the key features of the Great Society era. So, to give a little bit of context, JFK, in the third year of his term, wasn't able to get much domestic policy pushed through Congress, and this was a consistent trend throughout the full 3 years of his presidency. And so on November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated, and Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson takes over. And Johnson saw this as an opportunity to fulfill his dream of articulating on FDR's New Deal policies. And his first priority was civil rights. He signed the Civil Rights Act on July 22nd, 1964. And this established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which continues to fight workplace discrimination to this day. All of this was complemented by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which took away barriers for minorities, giving them better access to the tools to get their voices heard and vote. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 promoted equal housing opportunity, which meant that people could no longer refuse to rent to somebody or sell somebody who's a minority property. All this led to Johnson's war on poverty, and the first law that was signed under that was the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 that established Job Corps and work training centers for young people. It established Fiesta, the Volunteers in Service to America, which is a domestic program like the Peace Corps. Then the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 provide federal funding for schools that serviced low-income families, and it also made Head Start available to everyone. In addition to all of this, in 1965, the Social Security Act was amended to include programs like Medicare, which provides health care services to the elderly, and Medicaid, which provides health care services to the poor and the disabled. Today, 4 in 10 kids are on Medicaid, and it also pays for 50% of the nation's births. Moreover, it covers nearly 10 million disabled individuals. In order to promote cultural efforts, Johnson also signed the National Foundations for Arts and Humanities Act of 1965 to provide funding for the arts and humanities. This was complemented by the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, which established the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which in turn established PBS, as most people know, which had shows like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. When it comes to the environment, the Great Society era did a lot there. It implemented the Water Quality Act of 1965, which forced states to have standards for waterways. To complement this, there was the Clean Water Act of 1972, which put regulations on drinking water. Unfortunately, the Great Society began to dwindle, as most of you know from D-Force. Race riots were happening all over the nation in 1967, and protests over the Vietnam War were happening. And President Johnson, in light of all this, announced that he would not be seeking a second term as President of the United States. During Nixon's campaign for president, he promised the people that he would strengthen certain aspects of the Great Society while attacking Johnson on his efforts in Vietnam. In terms of the feminist movement, colleges started admitting women after 1960. Harvard began admitting women in 1977, Columbia in 1983, and the Higher Education Act of 1965 was amended, adding Title IX, which prohibited discrimination against gender. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 prohibited discrimination based on gender. Prior to this act, most creditors and banks didn't want to give women credit, single women at least. And so this act made it possible for single women to establish a line of credit. In terms of connection to class material, this chapter connects PT Force, the film we watched, as it went over the riots and it gave context to why President Johnson didn't seek a second term. And that's all. Thank you for listening.
The Great Society era had a tremendous influence on how public service and public administration is thought of today. Scholars in this era came up with the idea of the new public administration in response to a public sector that served the interests of the elite. These inequalities led to social unrest seen in the era's race riots, Vietnam War protests, and urban deterioration, which led to increased repression by the government and therefore again increased social unrest. Solutions to this cycle included implementing social equity principles within public administration, increasing responsiveness and transparency of the government, for example through the Freedom of Information Act in 1966, and increasing citizen engagement and decision-making through maximum feasible participation. The main critique of the new public administration was that decisions on who should benefit and how should be left to elected officials. The theme of insiders and outsiders also continued in this era, with efforts to empower outsiders, including racial minorities, low-income, unemployed, disabled, and elderly people, and promoting their inclusion into social, political, and economic life. Great Society policies also checked the power of insiders by tackling economic inequalities and environmental degradation by large corporations. The Great Society era changed the role of the government and public professionals and still impacts us today. The government was seen as responsible to care for its citizens by promoting health and equality, and to ensure a healthy environment for us all. The government increased citizen involvement in the political process, and citizens saw the benefits of government intervention in improving the quality of life. Public administration professionals were no longer seen as neutral administrators, and instead used social equity principles in their daily work. Many Great Society programs, such as Medicare and PBS, continue today and are viewed as integral government services.